Good morning and welcome to Dale Street Online. Now, it's been far too many weeks since we were at church together. I don't have enough fingers and toes to actually work it out anymore. It's definitely too long, but I hope even so that you're all well. If you've been fortunate enough to get away during August, then I hope you've come back refreshed, revitalised, and that you had a great time. Now, actually, having been away just for the weekend, but nevertheless away ourselves, it seems like one of the few positives that's come out of this situation is that the fact having to do church remotely and online as we are, it means you can go away and you don't have to miss church. So I guess there are some benefits to what's going on. Now, having said that, this morning, as this message goes live on the website, I will be away again. And yet you're still stuck listening to me, so maybe it's not all positive. Now, today we're going to start a new devotional series, and it's based around Isaiah chapter 53. Now, although as I say that, the verses we're actually going to look at this morning are actually the final three verses of the previous chapter. So it'll be Isaiah chapter 52, verses 13 to 15. Now, the latter part of the book of Isaiah contains what is known as the four servant sermons. Now, the servant, or the title servant, is a prophetic reference to the Messiah, who obviously we later find out is Jesus. Now, the fourth and the longest of these sermons runs from chapter 52 verse 13, where we're going to start today, right the way through to the end of chapter 53. There's 15 verses in total, and it's actually written like a poem, so it contains 5 stanzas, or groups if you like, of 3 verses each. So each week through this series we're going to look at those groups of 3 verses one at a time, and starting with this week's subject, which is titled The Shocking Servant. Now, when we think about Isaiah 53, and obviously the whole Bible is inspired by God, but there are some parts of it that kind of speak to us more than others. And I know one of the things I've enjoyed in particular about the Meet the Church segment, it's been finding out people's favourite verses, and not just what the verse is, but why it speaks to them. And I think it's fair to say, I don't know if you're like me, but every time someone said a verse, I've thought, I really like that one. That's a good one. And because there are verses like that which kind of stand out, and passages which stand out perhaps more than others. You know, things like Genesis chapter 1 maybe, or Psalm 23 is a classic. John 3:16 is a verse. John chapter 14, Romans chapter 8. I'm sure you can think of others too. And Isaiah 53 is right up there with these kind of passages as being kind of perhaps some of the most talked about, most read, most quoted verses there are. This because it contains such a clear prophecy of the events surrounding Jesus' death. Now, Isaiah here is writing 700 years before the events took place, and yet he describes the death of Christ in such staggering detail that there's no explaining it away other than that it's the direct work of God. Now, there are at least 9 different occasions in the New Testament that Isaiah 53 is quoted and applied directly to Jesus. So as I said, we're actually going to start at the end of Isaiah 52, verses 13 to 15. So verse 13. See, my servant will prosper, he will be highly exalted. But many were amazed when they saw him. His face was so disfigured he seemed hardly human, and from his appearance one would scarcely know he was a man. And he will startle many nations. Kings will stand speechless in his presence, for they will see what they had not been told. They will understand what they had not heard about. Now these 3 verses, the first stanza, if you like, of the 4th servant song in Isaiah, they speak of Christ's glorification in spite of his brutal death on the cross. What seemed like a terrible tragedy at the time turns out to be a channel of blessing for the whole world. So firstly here, in the first of these 3 verses, we have a picture of his unrivaled success. See, my servant will prosper. He will be highly exalted. The text begins by saying that Christ will prosper, which means that Christ will do well in every situation. And why, if you think about why will Christ do well in every situation, or why did Christ do well in every situation, it's because he followed God's will in everything he did. He had the wisdom to follow God's will, even in situations that appear to make no sense at the time. That wisdom didn't seem so wise on Good Friday. Jesus didn't really look like he was prospering, like he was doing well in the situation there hanging on the cross, beaten beyond recognition. But it's the wisdom of God that led Christ to the cross, where the world crucified its Saviour. The world crucified the Messiah that Isaiah is prophesying about. It might have looked to the world like Jesus was defeated that day, but little did they know that, certainly much less understand what was really happening that day. It's spelled out for us in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 verse 8, where it says, "But the rulers of this world have not understood it. If they had, they would not have crucified our glorious Lord." This wisdom of Christ here probably seemed quite foolish to the people there at the time, but this apparent foolishness leads to the following events, where he's raised up on Resurrection Sunday, and he'll be lifted up then when he ascends to heaven. He'll be highly exalted at God's right hand. Jesus is the Lord of glory. So we have a picture here in this first verse of his unrivaled success. What goes on, and secondly, as we ponder Christ on the cross, we see his shocking disfigurement. Verse 14, "But many were amazed when they saw him. His face was so disfigured he seemed hardly human, and from his appearance one would scarcely know he was a man." This gives quite contrasting images of Christ in these two verses. Christ exalted to the highest place in verse 13, and then Christ disfigured as he dies in verse 14. Surely Isaiah must have got something wrong here. How, if you were reading this at the time before Jesus had come to earth, it wouldn't make sense. Surely, how could you kind of make sense of those two contrasting verses? How could this happen? And who would possibly do that to the Messiah? We probably don't often enough take time to really consider that Jesus would have died in such terrible pain. I mean, sure, we objectively know that that's true and that's what happened, and we do think about that. But if you really think about it, if you look at the events leading up to Christ's death on the cross, during that day, what you see is that Jesus has gone through, prior to his death, 12 hours of torture. He was arrested in the middle of the night. He was slapped, pushed around, mocked, slapped again. He was crowned with thorns that went right down into his scalp. He was scourged with a large strap studded with bits of bone and stone and metal. His beard was ripped out. He was beaten again and again. He was then forced to carry his own cross through the streets of Jerusalem. Then nails were driven through his hands and feet. And he was crucified. And crucifixion is a horrible way to die. The Romans intentionally came up with it to make it as brutal and bloody as possible. They'd mastered the art of cruel killing. That day at Calvary, the smell of death was everywhere. Crucifixion really was a horrible way to die. He didn't even look human. He didn't even share the likeness of a man. The scene that day really is repulsive and horrific. And the Romans liked it that way because it sent a message. This is what happens to troublemakers. We have, if you think of the images we have of Christ on the cross, people wear crucifixions, these stained glass windows with the images on and paintings and all sorts. And you see that, you might have the crown with little trickles of blood coming down, and you can see the nails in the hands and the feet. But I think Jesus often looks still quite saintly in them, quite not peaceful, but certainly recognisable as a man. They don't really truly depict what the scene would have been like that day. You know, we sometimes sing the words, "When I survey the wondrous cross," and it is made wondrous, but by what comes after. But Isaiah here reminds us that there was nothing wondrous about the cross on that day. There was nothing but blood and pain and agony, torture and death. So in verse 13 we see a picture of his unrivaled success, and here in verse 14 we have a picture of his shocking disfigurement. And then thirdly and lastly, as we consider the cross of Christ, in verse 15 we discover his universal victory. Verse 15, and he will startle many nations. Kings will stand speechless in his presence, for they will see what they had not been told. They will understand what they had not heard about. He will startle many nations. The effects of his death have no national limits. Even though Jesus was a Jew dying on a Roman cross, he was also the Son of God. And because of this, his bloody sacrifice will provide cleansing and healing for many nations, for all nations. The cross didn't seem wondrous on Good Friday. Not just for Israel, not just for the Jews, not just for the Romans, not just for the Greeks, but for every nation on earth. And consider that every nation. Christ died so that his purifying blood might be sprinkled on many nations, even those that seemingly reject him, where Christians are persecuted. Christ was tortured and died for those nations too. China, Iran, North Korea, many others you can choose from. And kings will stand speechless in his presence. And you could replace the word kings there, I guess, with presidents or supreme leaders, or whatever the title they want to go by. All those people in power who think they're the ones in control. Yet Revelation 1 verse 5 makes it clear to us, talking about Jesus. He is the faithful witness to these things, the first to rise from the dead, and the ruler of all the kings of the world. He wouldn't stay dead. When he came the first time, they laughed at him. They didn't think a true king would be born in a stable or come from a backwater village like Nazareth. They were offended that he wasn't a front runner, so they called him a friend of tax collectors and sinners, and they didn't mean it as a compliment. They hated him, rejected him, and eventually crucified him. The religious leaders of the day, they teamed up with the political leaders to nail him to the cross. But Jesus wouldn't stay dead. Now we're done with him, they said. Or so they thought. But much to their amazement, he wouldn't stay dead. He rose from the grave. He rallied his disciples. He gave them their orders, and then he returned to his Father in heaven. And meanwhile his followers began to spread the news. He's alive. First in Jerusalem, then into Judea, then Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. Kill them, and others took their place. Nothing stopped them. Not persecution, not hatred, not beatings. Threats didn't work. Nothing could shut them up. You kill them, and yet the movement keeps spreading. 2,000 years later, and still the flame spreads to every corner of the earth. Even in countries like China and North Korea, the message is still spreading. A day is coming when every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. If you think the kings are shocked now, just wait for that day. Every knee will bow and every tongue confess. But this here is not just a word about the coming judgment. It's also a word about God's intention for all nations. When Paul was explaining his desire to preach the gospel where Christ was not yet known, he quoted Isaiah 52 verse 15 to justify his strategy. In Romans 15 verses 20 and 21, Paul says, "My ambition has always been to preach the good news where the name of Christ has never been heard, rather than where a church has already been started by someone else. I have been following the plan spoken of in the scriptures where it says, 'Those who have never been told about him will see, and those who have never heard of him will understand.'" What is a missionary's true ambition? He makes Christ known. He preaches the gospel. He tells the good news. In Paul's case, that meant a call to preach Christ where it had not yet been preached. And that's why Paul went out and preached in Asia Minor, then in Greece, and finally in Rome. It's the same with those nowadays who travel to share Christ with Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and with those who have no religion at all. And even after 2,000 years, it's still estimated that there's maybe a third of the human race, over 2 billion people, that have never yet heard a clear explanation of the gospel of Jesus. And that's why people are still going out there. And that's why we have Bible translators in distant lands, why we have missionaries bravely taking the gospel into kind of dangerous countries, places like China where there's real risk to being a Christian in those countries. And yet you've got Chinese believers who are trying to go out from China to then spread the good news to Muslim countries. God always wanted all the nations to hear the good news. And that's exactly why Paul quotes from Isaiah 52:15, which is a prophecy of the coming of Christ, who would startle many nations, cleansing them with his own blood. That cleansing was not just for Israel, but for all the nations of the earth. And when that happens, those who were not told about him will see, and those who have not heard will understand. It was always God's plan that the gospel should go forth to the ends of the earth, so that every nation would hear the good news. And this ought to be the ambition of every Christian. Do we see the beauty in the crucifixion? Do we know Christ as our Saviour? Do we rejoice that he has been exalted in the highest place? Do we see the beauty in the horrific scene of the crucifixion? Do we believe that Christ's blood will purify every nation on earth? And will we join in God's work of spreading the good news of Jesus to all nations? And that includes our nation. Don't think everyone has to go to the farthest corners of the earth. If everyone left to go to other nations, then there would be no one here to do the work either. There are people who need to hear the message right in our own towns, in our own villages, in our own streets even. The whole world needs to know about Jesus. Let's not keep it to ourselves. Anyway, thanks for listening. Have a good week and take care, and please keep in touch. Thanks.